again. Welcome back to another science lesson. Again, if you're in Google Slides, please turn the sound on, use present mode, and then click yourself through the slides. If you're in YouTube, remember that the links won't work, but I have a playlist available on my channel, and the document that's linked will be in the description of this video. Our presentation today is going to be over using fossils as evidence of past ecosystems and environments. Our objective for this slideshow is, I can understand past environments by using fossils as evidence. Let's start with the basic of what is a fossil. Fossils are the preserved remains or traces of organisms that lived in the past. Fossils can be used to interpret past events and environments. I tend to get a lot of questions about how fossils are formed, and the actual process of forming fossils is not something that you're actually responsible for understanding in elementary school. But to answer those questions that I get, the fossilization only happens under specific conditions. That's why everything that dies and falls on the ground doesn't turn into a fossil. So in order for fossilization to happen, the organism has to die and then be buried quickly in a soft sediment. That sediment blocks oxygen from getting to the organism, which the oxygen would normally help it decay. It's also going to lessen the amount of bacteria that's around there. And so the soft parts of the organism still break down, and the hard parts, like the bones or the teeth, horns and shells and things, those are left behind. And the hard parts actually turn into rock through a process called permineralization, which is way too complicated to explain for elementary school, but basically the minerals that are in the bones react with water and things that are in the ground, and it will actually turn them into rocks. So whenever we're finding a fossil bone, it's not actually the same composition of bone anymore. It has actually turned into a rock. There are lots of different types of fossils. Some of the most common, or the commonmost four, are actually on this slide here. So we have mold fossils and cast fossils, which actually kind of go together. The mold fossil is going to be an imprint of what the actual organism was, and a cast fossil is going to be a 3D model of what that fossil was. So it's where it's filled up with mud and rocks that's turned into stone in the shape of what it was, but it's not actually the organism. We have trace fossils, which would be things like the footprint you see in the picture, nests, or maybe even poop that was left behind and fossilized. If it was buried quickly, it could go through some of the same processes. And then the most common type, the type we're all familiar with, would be the body fossils, where we're actually getting those hard parts that were left behind that have actually turned into rock. So who studies fossils? The scientists that study fossils are called paleontologists. Paleo is a root word meaning ancient, and those paleontologists are actually studying the history of life on Earth. They actually have to look at rocks and things, the layers of rock and stuff that it's in, to be able to figure out what was going on as far as what was living at that time, what was living around it, adaptations it might have had. Students often get that confused with an archaeologist. An archaeologist is actually studying human lifestyles and cultures from the past. So they're not as interested in fossils, they're more interested in the artifacts that could be uncovered, like some pottery or things like that that went with people. The fossils are going to be just the organisms, the plants, the animals and things that lived in that time, and that's going to be, we're going to be looking at a paleontologist to study the fossils. Why do paleontologists study fossils? So keep in mind that the paleontologists are interested in studying the history of life on Earth. So they want to know all about a given area and what used to live there. By digging down in the rock and studying the rock layers and the fossils that are found in each layer, the paleontologist can determine what type of environment and ecosystem existed, the climate, and the types of plants and animals that lived in that area. We don't have any written records from millions of years ago, so the only way to figure out what it used to be there is to use the fossils as our clues. So you can see in the diagrams that I have over to the right, we have different layers. And so you're looking at layer 4, 3, 2, and 1, and each layer would be a different composition of rock, which is not depicted in this particular diagram, but it would also have different fossils of animals or plants, different organisms that lived in each layer. And so all of those things would give clues to the paleontologist about what life was like on Earth at that time period. The second diagram, we actually see the living organisms and how the fish might die, and then on top the lake gets filled in with sediment, and we have a land animal on top of that, and then later we see that monkey, which would indicate there was some type of a jungle instead of the open area that we see in the second picture. So the land changes and it builds up, it deposits over time, the different layers of sediment, and we're going to find different types of rock depending on what type of area it was, and different types of organisms, animals and plants. The fossils are going to be embedded in that rock based on how that area was at a given point in time. And that brings us to the law of superposition. It sounds super difficult, but it's really not. All it means is that the older fossils are going to be at the bottom, and the newer, younger fossils will be at the top. Okay, and you can look at the diagram off to the left, and you can see that we have relative dating, where we're just saying if it's older or if it's younger, and then we have actual absolute dating, where they can get pretty close in years. The closer to the top, the younger the layer is, they can get closer to the time period of when those rocks would have been there. As you dig deeper down, you can see that it's plus or minus 10 years, so they're not able to get exactly as close, but still, considering that they're digging down and talking about 140 million years ago, they can get pretty close to when the layers actually were formed. It makes complete sense for the oldest one to be on the bottom. If you think about it, those had to be there first for the others to get stacked on top of it. This is an area where students are commonly confused on exams and questions when they'll ask which layer is the oldest layer, the youngest layer. They're not thinking it through as much. So just keep in mind that the oldest layer is on the bottom. Anything that's below something else had to be there before whatever it is that was piled on top of it. So what do you need to be able to do with this information? As an elementary age student, you only need to be able to use clues to figure out what the layers might have been and the order that they happen. For example, if you see a fish, then you know that there was water in that particular layer. If you see specific plants, you know that it might have been a certain type of a forest. So like the fern that's on the left picture and then the larger leaf that's on the right, those are two different types of forests that would have those different plants. If you see winged animals, then you know that they were flying. If we look at teeth structures, we've already talked in one of the previous presentations about adaptations for teeth. So pointy teeth would mean that whatever organism you're looking at ate meat. Flat teeth would mean that it ate plants. So there's different body structures that we can look at on the organisms whenever we find the fossils to kind of figure out what they were adapted to live in, what kind of conditions they were living in. So if we look at different layers, on the left, we've seen this picture before. So we know there was an aquatic area, the water filled in, and then land animals roamed the area, and then most recently an ecosystem with monkeys and vines was in that area. That would be how it was happening. If you look at the picture that's on the right, we see the paleontologist on top, and he's finding that same area, but the picture that we see is more of what it would look like whenever the paleontologist finds it. So he's not able to tell that there was per se water on the bottom, other than the fact that the fish fossil is in the bottom layer, and also that type of rock would be a different type of rock because of all of the water that had been in the area at the time. The paleontologist in the picture would know that the top layer closest, the newest layer closest to him, probably had trees in it because monkeys live in trees. They're adapted with that tail for the climbing and the swinging, and so that probably was an area that had more trees due to the fact that he found a monkey fossil there. Putting it all together means we know we can look at where the layer is located to determine which one would be the oldest layer, which one would be the newest layer, and then we know we can look at the specific type of fossil to determine what the area might have looked like. So if we go back to the diagram from earlier, looking at this diagram, we can use all of the clues to determine that the oldest layer 4 was an area with water. I see kind of a big fish, so I would say deeper water. At layer 3, we see that it was still an aquatic environment, though possibly not as deep because we have the crab and the clam, the shell that's there. And layer 2, we now have a wetland environment. I know that because I see the frog, I see the dragonfly, I see some ferns, which typically go in a wet area. I know that frogs have to lay their eggs in water, but then they also need land to hop around on. So that would be why I would use those clues to put together that it had been a wetland area. And then on the top layer, we see the trees, and we see what looks to be a bird fossil there with the wings and the beak. So my guess for layer 1 would be the youngest layer, that we know that it's most probably was a forest. So we're able to look at the clues, we're able to look at the fossils, we're able to tell which one came first based on the order, we put it all together, and that's how a paleontologist tries to figure out the history of a specific area on Earth. Okay, so here's a new diagram for you, and I want you to look at this diagram and try to interpret it. Which layers do you think might have been aquatic layers? Okay, so if we're looking at this, we can go all the way down to the oldest ones, which on this diagram are labeled. So we know that layer A was the oldest. And all I see in layer A are some fossils of what look to be ferns or leaf-like plant fossils. In layer B, I can definitely see some fossils that look like they potentially could have lived in the water, some shells, some trilobites. In layer C, I'd see fish fossils and maybe an ammonite, which also lived in water. In layer D, I'm definitely seeing things that have 4 legs that look like they potentially walked on land. And layer E, again, I'm looking at things that look more like land animals, possibly even a human or a monkey skull there. So if I had to guess, if my question was which layers do you think might have been aquatic, I would have said layer B and layer C based on the fossils that have formed there. If we are trying to interpret this next diagram, the question is, which layer is the youngest? And so what we know is that the older fossils are on the bottom because they had to be there first, and the newest fossils or youngest layer would be at the top. So if I was looking at this, the answer to this question would be that the layer at the top with the mammals in it would be the youngest layer of this diagram. We have the opposite question for this diagram. The question is, which layer is the oldest? And so again, if we're still using what we know that the older fossils had to be there first, so they have to be at the bottom of the pile, and so layer 4 would be the oldest layer of this diagram. This last one that we're going to look at together is a little bit more complicated of a diagram. We have the different layers, and there's quite a few layers in this one, but they've also included a key or a legend off to the side indicating what each little picture represents. So you still have to remember about the order of the layers, that the oldest is on the bottom and the newest is on the top, but you also have to be able to go over and look into the key. And it not only has symbols or legend for the symbols that are actually organisms, but it has symbolism for what might have been happening with the rocks as well. So the question that we have, and this is one they would generally probably have multiple questions that went with the same diagram, but the question that I pulled is which layer were mammals present? And so if we're looking at the diagram, the only picture up there that indicates a mammal is what looks like a jawbone, maybe there on the far right. And so if you go through all of the layers of the actual diagram, luckily this one's in color, so that layer G, that orange layer that you see at the top, that is the only place that I see that jawbone looking symbol, and so I would have to say that layer G is the layer the mammals were present. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for watching the video about fossils as evidence of past ecosystems and environments. The next slide has some links that are interesting that go with this. There's actually a couple of really good videos. There's a Bill Nye, and he's always fun and interesting. There's also a 3-2-1 Contact, which is an older series, but I really like using that series with my students. So there's some good information about fossils there. And then there's one additional fossils activity, a few more practice questions, and of course answers are provided. Thanks for watching. This slide is the other videos that I found on YouTube that are either very interesting or they're very informative about using fossils as evidence. Most kids really like the Bill Nye series because they're upbeat, they're interesting. It does give extra information that you don't necessarily need to know for elementary school, but it's still really interesting facts. And then again, I really like the 3-2-1 Contact series of videos. They have a lot of videos for science. They're shorter episodes, and they actually have kids doing the interviews and doing the science. So I really like that series. I use it in my classroom a lot. If you're on YouTube, of course, these links don't work, but there is a playlist on my channel of these exact same videos under the Fossils as Evidence playlist. The activity, if you're in Google Slides, is linked by clicking on the word here. It will take you to a PDF of the activity. The first page is actually the activity, and the second page is an answer key. Again, if you're on YouTube, that link doesn't work. However, in the description of this video, I've included the link to get to that PDF practice page.